Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining me, a good friend of mine, Phil Kerpen from American Commitment, AmericanCommitment.org, who is here to talk about the effort by the Trump administration to end the regulation of carbon dioxide by changing the rules and getting rid of the 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment finding. Phil, great topic. Great motion, and I think they are actually doing this right, which I am very happy to see. Phil, great to talk to you again, by the way.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, we'll see. I never know how the courts are going to come down on anything, to be honest. But I think it's worth trying. You know, in the first Trump term, he was convinced that, you know, you can't go after the endangerment finding. And for anyone who's not familiar, this is the original finding that greenhouse gases endanger human health and welfare and therefore are subject to regulation under the 1970 Clean Air Act. And this is very tied up in a bunch of historical litigation because the Bush administration, of course, did not want to regulate greenhouse gases. And a bunch of liberal states, led by Massachusetts, went all the way up to the Supreme Court and said, no, you have to regulate greenhouse gases. They're going to kill us all. They're air pollution. Carbon dioxide is a pollutant. And in a ridiculous, in my judgment, 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court agreed with Massachusetts and said that carbon dioxide, a colorless, odorless gas that's essential for all life on Earth, may be a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And the EPA had to decide, based on the terms of the statute, whether or not it endangers human health and welfare. And the Bush administration, being somewhat weak-kneed, didn't decide to the contrary. They just punted it and they left it undecided. They just did what's called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, i.e., hey, just let us know what you think, but we're going to leave this unfinished business for Obama. And then, of course, Obama said, Clean Air Act applies. We're going to regulate everything. We're going to basically impose economy-wide regulation of greenhouse gases, not the right way by having Congress pass a law, but by grabbing the Clean Air Act off the shelf, as the Supreme Court had said we could, and using a 1970 law that was designed for a very different type of problem as the basis for economy-wide regulation of greenhouse gases. Now, when Trump comes in the first time, everyone convinces him, oh, leave this alone. You don't want to get called a climate denier. We can tweak around the edges of what the cost of carbon is, and we can dial back these regulations, but we shouldn't go after the endangerment finding. He was convinced in his first term not to go after this. This time is very different. This time he's going right at the heart, the legal predicate for all of the EPA's greenhouse gas regulations. And I think they've got a really strong legal argument. I don't know if it'll win in the end, but I think they have a really strong legal argument that, look, we've got this whole line of Supreme Court cases now that says that there's no more Chevron deference, that the agencies don't get to decide for themselves what authorities they have. And we've got all these major questions doctrine cases that say, when Congress wants a major new program, they need to say, we want a major new program. And so you've got all these very good legal arguments now. The problem, the challenge potentially is the Supreme Court almost never overturns their own precedent on statutory matters. And usually when they're reversing a decision, it's on a constitutional matter. And that's because they're the only people who can change a constitutional matter. Historically, the courts kind of said, when we get something wrong, it's a statutory matter, Congress should tell us by overturning us, by rewriting the statute, by clarifying. And so it's very rare for the court to overturn itself on a statutory matter. And that's why some people say this is a wasted effort. I disagree because I think this is very different, just given the stakes. This is going to be $1 trillion deregulation, the largest single deregulatory effort in history, because it takes the EPA out of the game of regulating greenhouse gases. It means no EV mandates, no regulation on the power sector, no regulation on the manufacturing sector. Just the implications are massive and enormous. And you've had a massive amount of turnover on the court. Roberts dissented in the original Mass versus EPA. I could see him flipping on sort of, hey, we should abide by our own precedent. But he could still, him flipping doesn't mean that we don't win the case. It just means it might be a 5-4. And, the normal logic really doesn't apply. The logic of, well, if Congress thought we got it wrong on a statutory matter, they would have overturned us. I mean, they tried constantly to overturn them. Biden repeatedly used his vetoes to protect Clean Air Act regulations of greenhouse gases, even when we had bipartisan majorities in the House and Senate that tried to overturn them. So I think this is an exercise well worth attempting. As I said, it's $1 trillion or so in savings for the U.S. economy if it does survive in court. And I think they've got some very strong legal arguments. And the other aspect of this, and I know I'm filibustering you a little bit, but I'll shut up in a second.
Hey, I'm like every other radio host, man. I love a good guest filibuster.
I always get told I need to have more give and take when I do these interviews, so I have a tendency to ramble. I acknowledge my shortcomings.
Oh, I'll jump in soon enough, but you go ahead and finish your thought, Phil.
The other aspect of that, I mean, first of all, the cost of it is massive and enormous, but I think that this effort is well worth undertaking, not just because there's a good chance that it prevails legally, but also, they didn't do the usual Republican thing of saying, well, we would never question the science. We're only going to do the economics and the legal. They actually do contest the science in this, and they do it in a very intelligent way. In the docket, they have a comment from the Energy Department. It's an EPA docket, but they have a comment from the Energy Department that is a very comprehensive report, a review of all of the climate science. And the lead author of it is Obama's former White House science advisor, Steve Koonin. And they've got 4 other named authors on it. So they've got very credible, prestigious authors on this named author document from the Energy Department that basically says, yeah, the Earth is warming, but it's pretty mild warming. Nothing we do is going to really make much of a difference for it. And these overstated claims about how it's in a existential threat or it's going to be apocalyptic, they're all disproven by the actual evidence that we have. And so they're engaging the science, not trying to avoid it. And they're doing it in a very thoughtful way that I think will really strengthen the legal arguments, but also maybe change the public debate a little bit, and sort of bring a little bit of serious scientific debate to bear on this issue, in addition to the legal and economic arguments. So I'm really encouraged by the way they're doing this, and even the cost estimates that they have. You can kind of tell when you look at them. They've got sort of like the ones by career EPA staff saying, "Oh, these regulations are great," and there's no cost. But then they've got an appendix where they've got an estimate that I think is very credible. And that's where I get that $1 trillion number. They find massive, massive economic harms associated with the regulations that they're repealing.
Absolutely.
So they're really engaging all fronts of this argument, economic, legal, and scientific. And I think they have a pretty good chance of winning in court. And if they do, it becomes very difficult for a future Democratic administration to do any economy-wide greenhouse gas regulation unless they do it the right way, by actually passing a law.
Well, so a couple thoughts on this. First off, they're doing it the right way. This is what I was alluding to. This is not a EO, right? Because there actually is a court case here.
Yeah.
This is
pursuant to an executive order, but Trump basically said, I want you to figure out how to get rid of this. And that's what we're now seeing is the legal process at EPA.
They're doing it through a rule change, and they're following the Administrative Procedure Act, which is sort of one of the huge legal issues when these things come up is if you don't follow the rule change process the way it's written out, courts can interfere with these things, and you have to start over from scratch, and it's a big pain in the ass. They are taking care, and I wrote about this in July, and almost now fully 2 months ago, noting that they were starting this by using the APA to protect themselves in court. So they won't get challenged on the APA. They're going through the rulemaking process, which requires a comment period, which is where you guys come in. We're going to get to that in a minute. Also public commentary, also publishing things ahead of time. That's a months-long process. And it's frustrating for people who are living with this endangerment finding in the meantime, because they're saying, well, we elected this president to smash things, and you want it to be effective, though. You want it to hold up. And this is why Lee Zeldin is doing it the way he's doing it. So let's talk a little bit, though, about Massachusetts v. EPA. Now, this was a 2007 decision. It went 5-4. And this is interesting. And I think that the court is maybe going to be friendlier than you think about this. The 5-4 court ruled that the EPA was required to do this based on an activist lawsuit that was filed, and Massachusetts took it up. that was intended to force the EPA into regulating this. Now, this was during the Bush administration. The Bush administration was not inclined to do this. If they had just waited a couple more years, Obama would have just done it anyway, because the statute, Congress had created the statute that sort of gave the EPA the authority to do this if they so choose. And what was interesting about Massachusetts v. EPA was that the EPA's own experts didn't think that this was the right thing to do. And they were saying that the science doesn't dictate this, and the court overruled them anyway. And this is the reason why Antonin Scalia was like astounded that they didn't apply the Chevron doctrine. So the Chevron doctrine actually, if they had applied it to Massachusetts v. EPA, the court would have left the EPA alone to not regulate this. And again, in the end, the EPA would have regulated because Obama was elected, the next year, and Obama would have wasted no time at all in promulgating the rule anyway, because the Clean Air Act allowed for that, the way that the Congress had structured this, even though it's bad science and bad policy. So I have a sneaking suspicion that when this comes back up, even though they've overruled the Chevron doctrine, that they're going to look at the process by which this was imposed on the EPA and say that Massachusetts v. EPA was badly decided. And it's not even really overturning a precedent. They're just going to overturn that ruling. Because the same people are going to challenge
I don't know. Jonathan Adler from, I guess he's at University of
Smart guy, totally smart guy. And I would defer to Jonathan Adler anytime. So what did Adler?
Yeah, he thinks the Trump administration will lose. He thinks that
Interesting.
He thinks that Roberts will basically say, I thought Mass versus EPA was wrong at the time, which is why I dissented, but now it's a binding precedent. And if we got it wrong, Congress would have overturned us, and they haven't, so we shouldn't. Is his take. I think for a variety of reasons that even if Roberts takes that line, he will not convince any of the other Republican appointees to take that line. So I'm not convinced, but he's the guy I usually turn. I usually look two places for these Clean Air Act climate legal analyses. I look to Adler and I look to CEI, but they're saying totally opposite things on this. So one of them is going to be right and one of them is going to be wrong.
CEI is very optimistic about this. Now, I'll give you another reason for hope. Is that I think this court is going to be very skeptical of how Massachusetts v. EPA even got to them in the first place, because that was from an era where activists were colluding with government agencies to launch lawsuits to force them into policies that they couldn't get done other ways. Now, I'll give you an example. This has nothing to do with the EPA. In fact, doesn't have anything really to do with the federal government, which was that this is in Minnesota, and I think it was during the 2018 cycle. Either that or it was the 2020 cycle. It may have been 2020, where, in fact, it was 2020. It was because of the pandemic. They were trying to force the state to accept ballots through drop boxes, I think is what the issue was. And the state wouldn't do it. They wouldn't. The legislature wouldn't act. I think the Republicans were in control of at least one house of that legislature at the time, and they wouldn't allow it. So rather than butt heads with the legislature, they just sued the Walz administration, remember, very Democrat administration, over supposedly civil rights violations and not having ballot drop boxes. And that allowed the Walz administration, and I forget who the Secretary of State was, but it was a Walz ally, they're all Democrats, to reach a settlement that basically imposed the policy without even though it actually contradicted state legislature or statute. And it got appealed to I believe it's the 8th Circuit for Minnesota. And the 8th Circuit said, absolutely not. We are not doing this anymore. And I think that this is an opportunity for the court, and I think they're going to recognize this, to put a halt to the activist lawsuit, policymaking by activist lawsuit charade that goes on with these regulatory agencies. I think they're going to say, when we go back and look at this, this was poorly decided, as you said. It was also never should have come to the court in the first place. This is a policy decision that should have been handled by the policymakers, and the court shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. I think they're going to be inclined to do it.
I think the standing analysis was very weak. The idea that states could sue to force a federal agency action like that. So, I mean, there were a lot of defects, I think, in that case. And, but I think the reason that I'm optimistic is similar to you, but a little bit different. I mean, I just think we've had so many cases recently where they basically say the legislative branch needs to legislate, like Congress needs to decide if we're going to have a major new program, if we're going to have major new policies. And we've never had any kind of economy-wide climate law passed in this country. So the idea that you can discover one in a law from 1970, I just think runs counter to so many recent cases. And so I think from a 30,000-foot view, I think they'll want to get there. And if you look at what EPA has come up with, they've got some very good legal arguments that I think a lot of the Supreme Court justices will like. Now, that said, if a guy like Jonathan Adler disagrees, you got to consider this as far from a slam dunk. So I don't know, but I think the exercise is worthwhile, and I'm hoping that people will engage. And the reason we are doing a public comment campaign on this. So if you go to AmericanCommitment.org, you can click. We've got a form there with I think we've got 3 pre-written comments, and it'll give you one of them randomly, and you can just sign on to it if you want, or edit it however you want. Add, if you disagree totally with me, you could say the opposite, or you can edit in whatever you want. We'll make sure that it gets officially submitted. But the reason we're doing this, these are not supposed to be popularity contests, so in theory it shouldn't matter whether the public weighs in with a whole bunch of comments. But the green groups have put about 90,000 comments in this docket right now, and conservatives have put very few. And I just don't like the atmospherics of the media coverage saying, public overwhelmingly opposed, and, that shouldn't affect judges, but I think it can to a certain extent. And so I just, we're not going to match what they can do because I don't have their kind of money or their kind of numbers. But, I just encourage people to try to bring a little bit of balance to the public record here in terms of just comments from regular people, grassroots type comments. And so we are doing this campaign. And if people want to deny, the media and the left the ability to talk about how totally one-sided it is, take a minute and send in a comment. And as I said, you can just send in one of our pre-written ones, or you can edit it however you want to your heart's content and make substantive arguments or vent your spleen or whatever it is, but it will go in the official docket. We'll make sure it gets submitted.
Well, exactly. I mean, look, they're going to, I don't want to say that it's unimportant. It is important. You want to give these people a sense of what the support level is like on both sides of this thing. And there's a public comment section or period for reasons. However, generally speaking, this is a checkbox item, right? The people who are looking to change policy are going to still promulgate this rule. But I do think it's helpful when arguing this in the public sphere in terms of political accountability to know that there was a lot of support for this rule change. And I think that, there's going to be a lot of opposition to it from all of the green groups that are benefiting from this thing. And I'm actually not so sure how much effort they're going to be able to put into that, because a lot of these groups were being funded either directly or indirectly through USAID. That money has kind of disappeared.
And, they're 90,000 right now. There's a week to go. We'll see if there's a big drop, but in previous major environmental rulemakings, they've been in the hundreds of thousands, and even I think some might have even crossed 1 million. So the number, in a sense, is smaller than it might have been when they had more access to federal funds and so forth. But it's still very one-sided. There's much more engagement from the green groups than there is from the conservative groups at the moment. So you could say maybe the number's not as big as it might otherwise be. That's true, but I still think it would be nice if we could show up a little bit and balance it out a little bit to the extent we can, and that's what we're trying to do with this campaign.
Well, and again, so go over to AmericanCommitment.org, and what you're looking for over there is the Stop Climate Craziness tab. Now, that's been up for about a month, and there's still, I think, a couple of weeks to go on this comment period.
Less than a week. It actually, September 22nd, end of the day, September 22nd. So Monday, through the end of the day, this coming Monday is the comment period.
Well, we want to get this cooking here. We want to get a lot of people in there to add their voices to this. And if you don't, a lot of times people don't know what to say on their own. That's the reason why they have um, these forms, so that you can just use the forms and submit the thing. Any of this is important. I would also argue, and maybe you can talk about this. Contact your congressman, contact your senator, because Phil's point earlier is valid too. Congress could act on this. Congress could fix this problem. It wouldn't even have to take the EPA to do it. You wouldn't necessarily need a rule change. Congress could amend the Clean Air Act to exclude carbon dioxide regulation.
Boy, that would be nice.
Wouldn't that be nice? Then you don't even have to worry about this. And this is a Congress in which you could actually maybe get that through, depending. The Senate.
You can't get 60 for anything in the Senate. So unless the
True.
parliamentarian in her infinite wisdom allows you to do it in a reconciliation bill, you can't do much of anything. And, we had a huge disappointment in the reconciliation bill, because, we tried like 5 different versions of the REINS Act to try to get them in. And that would have sort of globally prevented agencies from adopting major new regulations without congressional approval. So that would have affected this and everything else. And she shot down every version of it, even though, the impact on the federal budget would have been enormous. It would have been the single biggest deficit reducer in the bill. But Mike Lee went in with like 4 or 5 different versions, and she shot them all down. So for the moment, at least, it looks like any kind of major regulatory reform or a change like you're talking about would require 60 Senate votes. And that's out of reach at the moment. So that's the challenge we've got, is we've got a Senate where, some of her rulings, I'm going to get way off topic just for a second. I apologize. But some of her rulings on what could and couldn't be done in reconciliation were absolutely illogical and impossible to understand. And I'll give you the example that I found the most incredible. We got, for the first time under this big, beautiful bill, we now have a federal tax credit for contributions to scholarship granting organizations, for school choice scholarships, K-12 private school scholarships. In the House version of the bill, you could donate up to 10% of your income to a scholarship granting organization and get a dollar for dollar credit back on your federal taxes. So these organizations would have been able to raise huge amounts of money for scholarships, and it was available in all 50 states. So we would have finally brought school choice to all these liberal states, where so far we haven't been able to get it done at the state level. And she rejected that. She said, that's not budgetary enough. You can't do the House bill. And then the senators came back to her and said, okay, what if we put in this other bill, this other Senate bill, instead? And the 2 big changes are, instead of up to 10% of your income, it's only up to $1,700. So, these scholarship granting organizations need to raise all the money in smaller chunks, but I don't know why that's relevant to whether it's going to be done in the budget and reconciliation or not. But the other change, instead of being in all 50 states, it's now only in states where the governor opts in, where the governor says, I want to participate in this. And that is the Senate version that she said was okay. And that makes it, somehow having an opt-in makes it more budgetary than when it was just flat across all 50 states. And so instead of now having, private school tax credit scholarships in all 50 states, we're only going to have them in states where the governor wants them. And according to her, that's more budgetary than when it was in all 50 states. Now, I don't know what makes a governor opt in of a budgetary. I don't understand the budgetary character of that, but that was her ruling. No one has been able to explain this to me, but that was her ruling. So now, unfortunately, we've got kids in, the states that are least likely to have state level school choice scholarship programs also will not be able to get the federal tax credits because their governors won't want them, which is kind of horrible. But at least now we have this amazing political issue in every gubernatorial race going forward. Will you take the federal school choice tax credit scholarships or not?
Yeah. Well, again, it's better when Congress can do these things.
Yeah,
I will say
but
that.
I'm just saying the rulings on what they can and can't do with 50 votes are, I can discern no logic behind what you can or can't do.
It's not where we're at. And especially on this particular issue, the EPA can do this and the EPA should do this. And I think it's important because not only do I think that they need to end this endangerment finding, which is ridiculous anyway, but I do think that they need to give the courts an opportunity at least to end this judicial activism pathway to backdoor regulation. Regulation should come from politically accountable politicians, and it's either in Congress or it's in the executive branch, but it shouldn't be coming from the judiciary. And that's what happened in Massachusetts versus EPA. And I still think I'll just say I'm more optimistic than Jonathan Adler. I'm not going to at all ever argue that I'm smarter than Jonathan Adler about this stuff. And please, Jonathan, if you're watching, all due respect, man, mad respect for you. I'm just hoping you're wrong, pal. That's it.
Yeah, I don't see it as a wasted effort, even if it ultimately doesn't succeed. And I think it's got a pretty good chance of success also. And, I think having these legal arguments, these economic arguments, and these science arguments is beneficial for us, even if we ultimately lose, because I think we have the better side of the debate on all of these aspects. So I'm glad they're engaging it. And it's interesting, I think if he had done this in his first term, it would have been wall to wall, every headline, climate denial, science denial, all this kind of stuff. But I think public opinion on this stuff has shifted so much that they can't really make they can't make it a huge liability out of it for the administration. It doesn't work. It will blow up on them. And so I think that's why the criticisms have been relatively muted.
Yeah. Well, again, go to americancommitment.org, sign up. Get your comment in, whether it's one of the pre-written comments that Phil and his organization are providing you, or your own commentary on this. One way or the other, make your voice heard. Americancommitment.org. Stop Climate Craziness is the tab that you want to go in there. It's under the Take Action tab at the top menu. Americancommitment.org. Phil Kerpen, thank you so much for being with us, and we're going to keep an eye on this. We'll come back and talk about this more after the comment period's over, I'm sure.
Great. Thanks. Have a good one.